Welcome to The Unconventional Path, Entrepreneurship and Innovation Stories and Ideas. Hi, I'm Bela and Mike, coming to you from the Capital Region campus of Clarkson University in Schenectady, New York. I'm a former three-time entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and now the David D. Ray Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at Clarkson University.
And Guten Tag from Münster, Germany. I'm Mike Wasserman, Professor of International Management at the Münster University of Applied Sciences. Thanks for joining us this week. We hope you enjoy our podcast. The two of us want to take the lessons we've learned over the last 3 decades as entrepreneurs, investors, managers, and professors and leverage our network of interesting friends, former students, business partners, and others we've met along the way in our life's journey to bring you interesting stories, ideas, and insights into innovation, entrepreneurship, and the people that take unconventional paths to find happiness at work and in life.
Hey, before we get to today's guest, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Clarkson University
and the Münster University of Applied Sciences. And now let's jump right into today's interview with Devon Watson, who's had a really interesting career in venture capital, IT startups, and then took the next step in his career and moved over to a very large organization, Diebold Nixdorf, a $4.5 billion top 10 global financial technology leader, where Devon currently is the chief marketing officer. So with that brief intro, here we go. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, listeners. Today we have a special treat. We're doing a Skype interview with Devon Watson, and I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. But Mike and I are both on the line here with him. So it turns out that Mike and I both know Devon, sort of in different capacities. Devon and I worked together in early days of the VC firm that I was one of the co-founders of. And Devon and I worked closely together, and that's when I got to engage with him and interact with him, and we've kept in touch ever since. And Mike, how did you know Devon?
As a Clarkson alum, Devon has been very giving of his time back to alumni. So when I was on the faculty at Clarkson, Devon worked with our first-year business program extensively for several years and gave them good guidance and mentoring along the way. So, and then, Bela, when you and I met, we both realized that we knew Devon mutually. And so that kind of closed the triangle.
And when we started this podcast, we said we got to have Devon on the interview list because he's a real unique individual. So let's dive into this. So we're doing this on Skype, folks. So the sound quality may be not as good as some of our other interviews, but it should be wonderful. So exactly, we have a great guest to make up for any crappy sound quality. So Devon, are you there?
I am. Thank you for the kind introduction, gentlemen.
Yeah, excellent. So, Devon, when you go to a cocktail party and you go there and you shake someone's hand and they ask you, who are you and what do you do? How do you introduce yourself?
So at a cocktail party, I would usually dodge the professional intro, and I would say that I'm a over-enthusiastic ice climber, a recovering wakeboarder, snowboarder, and father of 2. That's what's front and center for me. But professionally, I would say that I'm, the chief marketing officer of the number 6 global financial technology company. I'm a prior startup and VC guy. So I've got kind of an interesting background spanning small companies, investment vehicles, and then large companies from both a growth and acquisition standpoint. So that's me in a nutshell.
Very good. So it's Devon Watson. I just wanted to get your last name in there because we've all been calling you Devon. And what's the company you work for now, Devon?
So I work for a company called Diebold Nixdorf. We're a global company. We're about $4.5 billion in revenue, operate in about 130 countries around the world. And we sell financial technology solutions. So we work with banks and retailers around the world. Most of the top banks, most of the top retailers are using our solutions. And we provide them with everything from software that manages how you bank, so mobile banking, software to power some of the branch experience, software to power the ATM channel, and then devices and services. So things like ATMs, point of sale, self-checkout, like you would see at the grocery store, and then a range of services to keep all of that stuff up and running so that consumers can bank and shop and have a fantastic experience with our clients.
So, Devon, $4.5 billion a year global company. What the heck is an entrepreneur doing in a place like that?
Well, funny story. I arrived there by selling them a bunch of software as an entrepreneur, and was lucky enough to meet a number of the senior management team during that process. You, of course, remember Prendo, which was a cloud technology software company I was with, and I was leading sales there. Met this company through it, and they decided back in 2012 that they were going to really embark on a long-term transformation to become much more of a software and services firm and move away from some of the device and manufacturing roots while still keeping that as kind of a core competency. And to navigate that, they really wanted to bring somebody in who understood how to think in terms of portfolio theory. So if you're a large corporation and you're, struggling with your change agenda, you're thinking through how you're going to innovate and attack the marketplace, who better to help figure that out than someone who's thought in terms of multiple strategic bets, as a VC is trained to do, and then has some capability to execute on that, which is, the entrepreneurial side. And there's, a old saying that I'm sure you're familiar with, that, entrepreneurs make terrible employees, which is often true. And before I joined the company, I warned the executives that were hiring me that, I wouldn't have a lot of tolerance for bureaucracy. I would be in a bull in the china shop when it came to any type of process that slowed things down. And I really wouldn't have a lot of tolerance for what I call non-propulsive activity, right? Which large organizations, they do have a certain need to put some guardrails around things, but at the same time, you can see all across big companies how they overdo that and turn a lot of work into completely non-propulsive work. So it's actually worked out very well. I've had, an executive team that's been very tolerant of that style. I've been able to deliver a lot of results that have moved the needle for the company, and recently joined the C ranks as a chief marketing officer. So it's been a very interesting adjustment and ride, moving from the VC and startup world into a large corporation. But I find that actually makes you an animal with some different skill sets that can be very beneficial.
Cool.
So let's talk a little bit, Devon, about your early years in your history. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to high school? Where'd you go to college? What'd you study?
Sure. So I grew up in the Finger Lakes of New York, and went to school at Skinny Atlas High School, went to Clarkson University, initially in a misguided attempt to become a wakeboard designer. That was my mission in life when I went to college. I chose Clarkson specifically because they had an engineering and management program that was kind of a cool dual major that not many people were offering. And that was during the dot-com boom. So I arrived at Clarkson as a sponsored wakeboarder who thought he had the engineering chops to design one. Turns out all I really remember from my foray into trying to come up with a design and CAD rendering that complex is that your planing velocity for any surface is 4/5 the square root of the water line. I still have no idea what that means. So being that it was the midst of the dot-com boom when I was in college, I decided it was probably a better idea to trade in my wetsuit, figure out how to squeeze myself into a business suit, and finished up my major in management information systems so I could get some exposure to how to code and make all this wonderful software work. And then I went from there to a small IT consultancy where I kind of, learned how to run some big projects and data warehousing, things like that. But I quickly figured out, we were reselling other people's software, and it became very apparent to me that that was no way to get ahead in the world. So I came up with an idea for a hosted reporting and analysis product. And in modern times, we would call that an analytic software as a service offering, but none of those words existed. So I came up with the idea, and my brother and I wrote the software. We got a couple paying clients, and then we went out to look for this thing called venture capital, because it turns out that growing a hosted software offering takes money that we didn't have. And through that process, I got to kind of understand the VC world a little bit. I met with, a number of different firms. By that point, it had turned into the absolute nuclear winter of venture capital funding, because we were on the tail end of the dot-com bust. And it was a very illuminating but very painful process as an entrepreneur. And it's, in retrospect, it's kind of funny how many people hated the idea of hosting software with customer data in order to provide it rather than going on-prem. But I got to know the industry. We weren't able to raise any capital. Nobody wanted to, write a couple $1 million check to a 23-year-old kid with a kind of wacky idea. So we shut down the business. My brother went on to IBM. I decided that come hell or high water, I was going to be on the other side of that table the next time I had one of these discussions. So I set out with the pretty audacious idea that I was going to become a venture capitalist. And as you probably know, there's only a couple thousand of those jobs on planet Earth. I did not know that at the time, and they're mainly occupied by folks from a very few number of schools, so it's really hard to get in. But I wrote an investment report, and I sat in a junky apartment that I could barely afford, eating ramen, and sending this investment report to every single VC firm that I could possibly hunt down, calling them. It's a very small industry, so it got to be a little bit of a joke. And I did not send my investment report to my future boss, Bela. They got it from another VC firm. I don't know if you remember this part of the background, but it's pretty funny. So I think it was our friends at the fund in Albany that actually passed it to you. And then I got a call from either Bela or Brad at High Peaks, and they said, remember you pitching, you didn't send us this investment report, looking for a job, what gives? And I said, well, you guys shot me down pretty hard. I said, well, we thought your idea was crap, but we thought you were pretty good. So why don't you come in and have an interview? And so I drove on down to Troy, New York, and got hired onto the team and spent the next 5 years learning all about the venture capital world and, the world of growing software companies, working with Bela.
So, Devon, I think you said something there that actually there's two things I want to explore a little bit that I think our listeners will be very interested in. One is sort of this approach to getting a job, right? Most people send out resumes, but what you did, and I want to dive into this sort of where the motivation, the idea for this came from and how you approached it, was what you did was you said, look, here's the industry I want to work in. Here's something that these people value. And so you went and did an example of that piece of work. So it's sort of like an artist, a graphic artist trying to get a job at an art firm is going to send them their portfolio of, art stuff that they have done. So you took sort of a similar approach, which I think is very interesting and most of the times not done, very rarely outside of sort of the architecture, performing arts, fine arts sort of industries. So where did that notion come from? And talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So actually, one of the things that spawned the idea, and I'll give you a couple examples of where I've seen a similar approach in other folks over the years that's really worked. So back when I was in high school and college, I was getting paid in the summers to wakeboard, which I still maintain is the best exchange of value ever, even though it didn't involve much money. And I remember one very vivid lesson. where the marketing director for Hyperlight, which is the wakeboard company I rode for, was in town, and a TV crew showed up to this lake where we were doing some sort of expo. And I went jogging up, and I was, so Mr. So-and-so, the TV crew's here. And he stares at me and he goes, "Devon, what the hell do I care? Go do it." And I was like, "Well, I've never done a TV interview." And he goes, "Do you have any idea why I pay a punk kid like you with a mohawk to hang around in a boat all summer?" And I said, "No, I honestly have no idea." He said, "Well, back up. What do you think we sell?" I said, "We sell wakeboards, sir." He goes, "No, we don't. We sell an image. That is the one thing that we sell, and that is why I pay you." And it was comical at the time, but in retrospect, it's one of the most brilliant marketing lessons I'd ever heard, because you are always marketing an image, right? And even in my current role, selling financial technology solutions, these are very complex, right? These are big decisions. But people are also buying in because they believe in who we are as a 20,000 person organization. So when I was trying to break into the VC world, what better way to prove, right, that you are that archetype to sell the image than to do the actual work? So I wrote that report with that in mind to, cut through the clutter and, forget the pedigree on my wacky resume. Let's look at what I can actually do for you. And, people also pay attention when you provide them a little bit of value, right? And the same applies to networking. If I, want to connect to somebody, offer them something, to introduce them to somebody else. I think whenever we're looking at our professional networks and somebody reaches out and says, "I'm trying to move my career in this direction," I always try to think of 2 or 3 people to introduce them to. And if you can provide some value, people generally pay attention. And if you can prove that you can do the work, then all that's left to prove is that you can fit into the culture, right? So that's how I thought about it. And, it was funny, Mike mentioned in the opening some of these business plan panels that I've sat on at Clarkson. And, obviously, Bela, you and I at High Peaks Ventures, we sat on dozens of these every year. So most of them are a bit of a blur. But one of the ones that always stands out to me, and Mike, I don't know if you remember this, we had the freshmen all had to come up with a business plan that they could actually run on campus. They present the business plan freshman year, first semester, second semester, they actually have to run this thing. So it has to be pretty nuts and bolts. It can't be pie in the sky because they actually have to do it. And one of the teams came up, and you could ask for, I think it was maybe up to $2,000, $5,000, something like that. They asked for 50% more than the limit. And a number of the panelists kind of gave them a hard time. "Why are you doing that?" Et cetera, et cetera. They wanted to get a machine that would help them engrave or print logos on glassware, I think it was. And I asked, so why do you think you're confident enough to raise more capital than everybody else here? And they didn't realize what they were sitting on, but they were sitting on the perfect answer. And they took out a 3-ring binder. And they go, "Well, we already went around and we pre-sold our entire year of projections. So we've got orders. We just need the extra money so we can actually fulfill on the demand we've already locked up." And I mean, at that point, why wouldn't you give them the money, right? So they had done that one little extra thing that proved far more than anybody else that they could actually get it done. And I think that's a huge differentiator if you can pull off a move like that.
I love these things, Devon, because I'm going to call it a Devonism, but when you talked about avoiding non-propulsive activities, everything from you sending out the investment reports to these students pre-selling the binders, these are all, I think, really cool examples of propulsive activities, right? That they help somebody move forward, and they're not time wasting and energy wasting. So I like that. Exactly. Devonism. I don't know if you invented it, but I'm going to give you credit for it.
Fair enough. Yeah, and actually, funny thing in retrospect, at least I remember doing one of the deals from my investment report, and Bela, that was Allworks, which was small business telecommunications device company in Rochester that we invested in and did well with. So it was pretty cool to see that actually come to fruition.
Well, that's how it's supposed to work. Right? So that's exactly how it's supposed to work. You look at an industry, figure out an investment, make it, and hopefully you make some money. So you've been on both sides of the table on the VC and raising capital part. And, I think, again, we have many listeners that are entrepreneurs. They're thinking about raising capital. What sort of, is the top 3 bits of advice that you would give to someone who's thinking about raising capital? Not just necessarily from a VC, but sort of, raising private equity of some sort. And what do you think are the things that, let me ask the question a different way. What are the things that people screw up the most? Because I think a lot of people answer the question of, what's the 3 most important things? Well, I'm going to flip it over. Like, what's the thing that people screw up the most?
Absolutely. So let me start with the what not to do, and then go to the what they screw up the most. I think for most people contemplating raising capital, the best answer, at least half the time, is don't. There's usually a way to bootstrap something and finance it with customer revenue, and that's all. That should always be option number 1. If at all possible.
Yeah, sort of another way of, exactly. Another way of saying that it was the best way to raise capital is to sell your product or service to your customers.
Exactly. Because then you're proving it, right? You're doing the real work that shows that this isn't pie in the sky. It's something people actually want to part with their money for. You've got some level of product market fit. Barring that, if it is the right model, and it isn't always, to go raise external and dilutive capital, because whether you're raising it from, funds, friends, families, or fools, any which way, it's going to come out of your equity. So it's a non-trivial decision. The thing that I think usually gets mucked up the worst is an over-reliance on 2 things. One, wacky projections. And this is a Bela-ism that I use nearly monthly when I was in a prior role as vice president of strategy, and I was working on a lot of M&A work. I would use this almost daily. Everybody knows there's only 2 facts about projections. Number 1, they're wrong. Fact number 2, they're high. The only 2 facts we have. Everything else is some sort of a guess or assumption. And it's one of my favorite Bela-isms to apply. So I think that's one of the mistakes people make, is really just going too far down the path of financially modeling stuff that really doesn't matter, right? There's no net present value calculation or any other silly stuff that might get taught in an MBA program that's going to actually prove that you can generate cash flow with this product.
Yeah.
So that's
go
ahead.
One of the things I was going to say is that one of the ways that I have characterized that in my class is to say that the only thing you need to do with your financial projections is to make them believable. Because I know they're wrong, they're wrong, but they just got to be believable. And the challenge with many financial projections is they're not believable.
Right.
Well, and my thing that I've always told the students is pro forma is Latin for bullshit.
I love that one. That'll be my new Mike-ism.
Okay, it's 1 apiece now. We're all even here.
Yeah.
Bela will win, though. He's older.
Oh, for sure. These are cumulative over time. So the second thing that I see people really messing up is trying to come up with some sort of business plan that gets you all the way to success. And, planning that far ahead, I think is somewhat futile. The best entrepreneurs and even the best entrepreneurs, in my mind, structure the path towards success in a set of experiments with some gates. And they say, okay, if I'm going to get to this end state and I have this idea of how the business model is going to work and I have the following unit economics that would make this very profitable, I need to prove whatever it might be. Technical viability. Then I need to prove the distribution and channel market to actually get this thing out into the world. And then I need to prove X. And if all these things in this sequence prove true, then we can throw money at it to scale it, and it'll be a worthwhile investment. And being able to pull those things apart and set up an orderly set of experiments that allow you to deploy risk capital to get to proof points that make you more confident in going to the next one and continuing on or stopping is a very rare way of thinking. But in my mind, really good entrepreneurs do that. Really good intrapreneurs can do it with great effect. Because if you, in the world of startups, you can sometimes get away with not thinking of it that way. In the world of a large organization, if you're going to go ask for $5 or $10 million to go down whatever path, you're going to be a hell of a lot more successful if you go in and say, dear CFO, I need $1 million to get to here. If it proves out, then I think we're going to need to spend $2 million going to the next gate here. But along the way, here's how we're going to cut our losses if any of these things don't pan out. So that's the other thing I see people, skip over or not really think about.
I like it, kind of a real options approach that there's a gate and that there's a second level of investment that's needed, but there's an exit plan if it doesn't work. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, and prove some of the big assumptions and big unknowns before you go double leverage your house or something.
Yeah, experiment, small, quick. It's okay to fail fast, but limit those losses, right?
There's nothing more costly in time or treasure than failing slow.
Love it. So maybe tell us a little bit about how your knowledge and skill set has evolved over especially the last, several years that you've been at a very large company. What's changed in kind of how you see the world, or has anything changed in how you see the world and how you see business and how you see success from an organizational standpoint?
For sure. Really interesting question. So, I'm as a big company guy, quote unquote now, I guess a Fortune 1000 company, I don't think I could have been as effective if I hadn't previously been in these entrepreneurial environments where you need to be very resourceful, you need to be very scrappy, and you need to be very protective of your time. And you do see a difference in some of the people that come from those backgrounds versus somebody that might spend an entire career where they don't get taught that at a large organization. Instead, they get very good at bureaucracy. So it's kind of a constant battle in my mind to make sure that a large organization has guardrails because it needs those, but at the same time doesn't turn into a bureaucracy. So for myself, I found that venture capital and startups were a really good training ground for me to figure out how to identify and then prioritize what to execute on for the highest possible payoff. You've only got so many calories. You've only got so many hours in a day. There's no points for being busy all the time. So what things can I do that will have the outsized return on my investment of time, calories, et cetera? So VC and startups really teach you to prioritize that. A large corporation, on the other hand, teaches you how to organize large groups and how to orchestrate them in order to execute big things. So some of the stuff that, I remember being a startup operator, I wish we could do X or Y, right? Wouldn't that be great? And it's darn near impossible sometimes. And you just have to go to a scrappier, version of that big idea you had. At a big company, you've got the capability to do those things, but you need to be able to orchestrate it so that it actually happens and things happen in the right order and people don't get stuck and you're not wasting other people's time. And those are just, things that the startup world doesn't necessarily teach because you're dealing with such small groups and smaller problems and things that can be sequenced easier. A big company allows you to learn that. And for me, the old Peter Drucker line, let me see if I can try to get this right. Efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things, right? And that to me is kind of where what you learn in a small company and what you learn in a big company marries up, right? A startup operator is going to be very good at picking the right things for the highest payoff, and a big company gets very good at doing those things correctly once they're identified. So for me, it really brought it all together. But you do need, some organizational buy-in to be allowed to execute that way. I've been fortunate through my career to have teams around me and, executives that were bought into the way I wanted to execute and move quickly. And it's paid off well, right? If you look at, for example, the past year of what we've accomplished as a marketing organization, I'm incredibly proud of this past year. And we changed a lot about our company. So Diebold Nixdorf is the result of two very large companies in the financial technology space doing a merger about 2 years ago. We had to integrate across, an American working style, a German working style, and then, all of the different hundreds of countries we operate in. And in 1 year of, kind of turning this marketing organization towards a more agile, a more empowered, a more startup kind of mindset, we've changed the visual voice of the company. We've launched a podcast. We've, increased our, digital capabilities by over 300%. We've changed the logo for the firm. I mean, just tip to tail, massive transformation of the way we describe ourselves. And those are things that, if you've got that startup mindset, you can move mountains in a large corporation when you're given the reins to do so.
So Devon, that brings up an interesting point. You talk about this merger of two companies, a German organization, an organization from the United States, and cultures. So as sort of chief marketing officer, you have overall responsibility across the globe, I would imagine, for these types of things. How do you sort of approach the cultural challenges, the work styles, the sort of expectations that people have in a global company?
Yeah, that's an ongoing learning process and construction zone for everybody. But I'd like to think that we've gotten pretty good at it. But you never get to the end of that road. So kind of coming into our merger, I had been fortunate enough to travel a lot in my roles in strategy and leading the product development teams and things like that. So, for this company, I've been all over the world and met tons and tons of our employees and spent time with them, break bread, learn how they think, learn what's important to them. And there's a few things that, kind of always come out as pretty uniform, right? People want to work with other folks that respect their contributions and acknowledge it. People want to work in a work environment where, you don't have to put up with a jackass. People want to know that what they're doing is pretty. So there's all these kind of common threads that, work across whatever cultures. And it's surprising how often you can lose sight of those little things that do pull people together. The things that are more surprising are usually in some of the things around communication style, some of the things in terms of what is considered a norm. So I'll give you a couple examples. So bringing together an American corporation and a predominantly German one, we didn't want to be the next Daimler Chrysler. So we were being very, very intentional about doing a lot of work to integrate our teams, spend a lot of time person together. We basically have, a 50-50 integrated kind of leadership structure from these two companies that we brought together. And in the first couple months, we were talking past each other. We were arguing about things. And then there started to appear. And once I noticed it, and I actually stopped the meeting and I explained this to my peers. So an American corporate culture, a lot of these companies, founded after World War II, a lot of military influence, very command and control oriented. Whoever the ultimate decision maker is, who approves or disapproves of a decision, if somebody downstream of me makes a bad decision, it's my water to carry, right? So I have to live with it, and I'm either going to, succeed or get fired based on what people downstream do. In the German culture, a lot of their corporate culture is shaped by the fact that they have a very high degree of education, right? Advanced degrees are more heavily subsidized by the government, so there's more masters, more PhDs at work, and because of that, there's a very academic slant to it. So to make that very tangible, we would have conversations where an American would say, "We're going left," which to an American leader means, I've taken all the input, I've made the decision, it's time to go left, everybody, and everybody moves left. In Germany, that is the opening of a vigorous intellectual debate on the merits of going left versus right versus going straight up, and what the pros and cons of each would be. And if we don't vigorously and intellectually debate that, it would show a lack of respect for the decision-making process. So they will engage in a debate sometimes purely out of what they think is politeness. And it was a startling moment when I watched us do it, and I was like, holy cow, guys, you got to know that he finds this insufferably arrogant, and you have to know that he finds not debating it to be very insufferably flippant. So it's really interesting, and as you learn those sorts of things, then we kind of understand each other. We might still want to engage in the debate or what have you, but you can become a very, very effective management team once you kind of latch onto those differences, which actually make you stronger. For instance, if you work with anybody from the Netherlands, right, they have a work style and communication style in the Netherlands where they can't sugarcoat anything to save their life. They're culturally incapable of sugarcoating. But consequently, if you need to figure out where there's a problem, always ask the Dutch person, right? You're going to get a straight answer. So I think it's a never-ending process to make all these different cultures and communication styles work together. It's the right amount of empathy and kind of understanding where each other's coming from. It makes you far more effective as a team.
Hey, Devon, that was, I was sitting here listening to what you were saying, and I'm going, I'm glad we're recording this because the way you articulated that and the examples you gave were really spot on. And I think there's a lot of just wonderful lessons in there. So that was fabulous. Thanks.
Happy to help, for sure.
So we're starting to hit our time boundary here, which is a soft boundary. But Devon, one of the things that's always impressed me about you is your ability to connect to a wide range of people and give what I think has always been really thoughtful and meaningful advice to people. So maybe you could share a little bit, and it's a little hard with a podcast. I know you have some experience in this domain, but it's hard because you don't exactly know your audience. But in general, if you're thinking about people who are maybe contemplating a career switch or people contemplating doing something entrepreneurial, what advice would you give them?
Sure. So maybe I could start with just some general ideas, because these are things that I personally try to enact and bring into my work style, and then maybe I'll pivot to more specifically to people that are in a career change of one form or another. So the things that I try to think quite a bit about how I work, how I can be effective, how I can maximize the outcomes of the time that I invest. And, I think we should all think about these things because we've all got, hobbies to pursue. We've all got families, and, you can't let one part of your life dominate the others. So being super effective in the way that you work and making it enjoyable, I think, is important. And the attention economy that we're living in makes that damn near impossible unless you're really vigilant. So we've got all these things that are just kind of dragging on our time, all these different distractions. So I personally think a lot about doing deep work where you really concentrate, you're not being distracted, you're not being interrupted by email or phone calls. And when I get into that deep work mindset, I go all the way through on it. And sometimes that happens in a surprising place. I was ice climbing last season, and, I had some time to myself while I'm climbing up the route, and I'm a little bit on autopilot, paying attention to what I'm doing, but all the other thoughts clear away. And I was able to, crystallize one of my thoughts on how we're going to position a certain product line. So doing deep work all the way through, I think, is important. I try to touch items once, and I think this is at least for me, this has been a breakthrough. If you're looking at email coming in or whatever, if I read it, I'm going to respond to it. If I'm not going to do anything about it right now, I won't even look at it. And then the third and fourth things that I think are just super important to help with your sanity and your career trajectory. Don't be busy. I think it's a toxic style that's emerged on planet Earth where people are proud of the number of hours. I'm proud of the outcomes. Sometimes that means that, I have to do 150,000 miles in the air, in a year and, miss birthdays and stuff like that. Other times, I might have a 30-hour work week and get in 2 workouts and a mountain bike ride and still get the same thing done. I'm going to be proud of the outcome regardless of how I got there. Sometimes I might have to really work hard. Other times it might just be easy for a change. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then the final thing is never be a bottleneck for your team. And this is a behavior that I think we've all seen in a lot of places. But the idea of being a servant leader, so your job as a leader is to break down barriers, to provide vision to the teams that are working for you, and then make sure you're getting the hell out of the way. And if there's anything stopping them, you remove it. And sometimes the thing stopping them is they need to check in with you on X or Y. You got to make the time. You got to get that done. So not being a bottleneck. So those are the things that I personally just think a lot about and try to do well against. In terms of career change, that's a really interesting question, Mike, because I think, for people that are early in their careers, we're looking at a future that is going to be navigated very differently depending on what your background is, what your skill set is, and how that's going to collide with this tsunami of automation, right? So, I'm thinking of people in certain back office functions, right? What's the future for accounting? I don't know, but I'd want to think long and hard about it. What's the future for legal documentation? I don't know, but I would think long and hard about how it's going to collide with automation. So my 2 cents on career change and looking at potentially new ventures is, I would seek to be as and I'm borrowing this term from somewhere else. I don't recall who originally said it, but I would seek to be as intellectually ambidextrous as I possibly could. Because the more that you can, understand technology, you can think in terms of very rigorous problem solving, and you can apply some art and some storytelling and some empathy to the way you then evangelize what you're trying to do, the more valuable you'll become and the more optionality you'll have in your career path. So, I would encourage anybody that's, looking at a change of one type or another, take it. Right? If it meets that criteria of not pigeonholing you, of allowing you to develop that intellectual, ambidextrous nature and really round yourself out, I just think that's the formula for success in the future.
Love it. Great words of advice and great things to think about for our listeners. Bela, last question.
So, Devon, is there anything else that, any other points that you'd like to make or words of wisdom that you have to offer to sort of our listeners before we wrap this up?
I think that was the smartest stuff I could come up with to say at the time.
Well, I have one more question for you then. Okay. So how do you, I mean, you have a family, you clearly like to do outdoor stuff, you have a pretty high demanding job. How do you sort of do the life balance tightrope?
It's a great question. For me, that comes down to, this set of things that I, kind of keep front of mind that I mentioned, doing your deep work all the way through, touching items once, refuse that metric of busyness, and, allow and enable your teams to execute. I'm not perfect at all those things, but they've, at least for me, they seem to be the recipe that allows for some level of sanity as you balance, your profession, your home life, your interests, all of those sorts of things. So for me, that's the recipe, and then tweaking those dials allows it to all kind of stay in at least some semblance of balance. And then for me, I do a bunch of really weird human optimization stuff. So, for instance, if I'm commuting, I'm always listening to some sort of super nerdy podcast. At the moment, I'm into a podcast from a guy named Peter Attia, who's a physician that thinks very hard about health span optimization and enacting all these like little tricks that just help you. So for instance, I won't eat any sugar or carbs until dinner. I can't get rid of them entirely, but if you get rid of your insulin spikes, your brain performs better throughout the day. If you can have 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up, your body knows that it's not in a starvation mode, and you get basically your body firing right. You don't end up with any insulin spikes. Other things, if you get on a plane, right? You'll notice so many people get on a plane and have a cocktail and then suffer for the next 14 hours en route to Singapore or wherever we might be going. If you look around, the folks that look more rested, that are a little healthier and, seem to be executing well, they get on the plane, they have a bottle of water, and they go to sleep. Right? So there's just all these little tricks that I think, if you build in to your life, just help add to that performance nature and, help achieve that semblance of balance.
This is cool. I'll have to check that out. I mean, I like to say I have limited resources and I need to do the best I can with what I've been dealt. So that's cool stuff, Devon. Thanks.
Well, gentlemen, I will say that as a 60-plus-year-old, let me just leave it at that, I'm very interested in those types of things.
Absolutely. It's I find those little changes to be just fascinating in how they pay off, right? This sugar one for me was actually fairly transformative. I made the choice like a year, maybe a year and a half ago. And for the simple reason that in a relatively normal workday, I was back to back on everything. And I couldn't withstand that little dip that every human being has after lunch. That was too much of a productivity hit for me to tolerate. So I said, all right, how do I, make it so I can operate at, 85% of cognitive ability for, 8 to 10 hours straight? Get rid of every bit of sugar and you can actually do it. It's amazing, right? So
I'm going to try.
It's an interesting area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was the name of that podcast again, Devon?
It's called the Peter Attia Drive, and it's got enough hardcore, biology and molecular biology in it that I absorb about 35 to 40% of it. But Peter Attia and also Dr. Rhonda Patrick, she has a podcast as well, are just fascinating for performance optimization.
Well, great. I will make sure that we put those in the show notes. So let's wrap this up. Hey, Devon, it was really great to catch up with you again. And thank you very much for participating in our podcast here. I think you said a lot of really insightful things and that our listeners will really enjoy.
Well, I really appreciate it as well.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Our pleasure. Like I said, you're the talent. Mike and I are just the narrators here. Anything you want to close with, Mike?
No, thanks, Devon.
I really appreciate it, gentlemen. You guys have both been super influential in my career. And Bela, getting your coffee and doing all the grunt work for 5 years was a fantastic time that I wouldn't trade for anything. And Mike, I've always loved, coming up to Clarkson and doing those business plan competitions. And I've made a few fantastic hires out of your student body. So look forward to talking to you guys again.
Great. Thanks, Devon.
Thanks, Devon.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, Mike, I thought that was a great interview and discussion with Devon. He had some really good takeaways. And I also thought, given the fact that you were in Germany, I was in upstate New York, and Devon was someplace in middle America. Where you remember where he was exactly?
I think he's in Denver, isn't he?
Is it Denver?
He's in Colorado.
Oh, okay. I thought Indiana.
Well,
Yeah.
no,
Oh,
Ohio is
I
where
thought
home base is. Is he in Ohio still?
Yeah. So I thought he was. Yeah, I think he was in Ohio. Anyway, I thought it was pretty good. That was one of our first three-way discussions and conversations, and I think it went pretty good. But regardless, so I thought Devon had a couple of really good gems. So what was your top takeaway, Mike?
Well, I love this idea of having little tolerance for non-propulsive activities, quote unquote, coming in from an entrepreneurship and a VC background into a big company. I love that. And I love how that dovetailed with his focus on he only cares about results, not about effort. It's not how much time you spend on something. It's how well you do the job at hand. What do you think, Bela?
So I think that right along with what you're saying, or I think this is an example of what you're just saying about this low tolerance for non-propulsive activities or a real bias for action. I love the way he talked about when he decided he wanted to work in the venture capital business. He knew he didn't go to an Ivy League school, so he knew that was sort of a strike against him, I'll say. And so what did he do? He wrote an investment report. And investment reports are exactly the thing that is sort of the job that's done by entry-level folks when they come into a venture capital firm. And so he wrote one of these, and he sent it around along with his resume. And I just thought that was, it was so thoughtful because it's not something that's typically done outside of if you're an architect, people do that all the time, right? They're looking for a job. They send out their portfolio. If you're an artist, whether fine arts or performing arts, you send out, audio tapes or pictures of your paintings or creative work. So in those industries, it's done all the time. But in sort of the other parts of the world, it's not done at all. And he took that and applied it to finding a job in the venture capital business. And that's what opened doors for him because people saw this and said, "Ooh, wow, here's an example of what this person actually does and how well they do it." And as he told in his story, that's what landed him or got the door open for him. And then because he was a great guy, we ended up hiring him at High Peaks Ventures. And that was great. So I thought that was my number one takeaway.
Cool. And it just hit me because I'm a knucklehead. Diebold Nixdorf is headquartered in Canton, Ohio, also known as the home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Ah, excellent. Excellent.
Thanks for joining us. We're happy that you shared our podcasting adventure for this week with Devon Watson with us, and we hope you found the last hour or so interesting and thought-provoking. We have, as we always do, 2 small requests. If you have questions about what we discussed or questions for Devon, suggestions about future topics or potential guests, lay it on us. We'd love to hear from you. Our email is bela.and.mike@gmail.com. And number 2, if you like what we're doing, hit subscribe on your podcast app if you haven't already, or hit like. Even be radical and consider writing a quick review from us. We'd really appreciate it. If you know people that might find this interesting, please share us with them.
That's it for this week from here in scenic Schenectady, New York. Thanks for spending time with us. We look forward to having you join us in our next episode. Hey, Mike, see you next week.
Sounds good, Bela. Have a great week, and auf Wiedersehen from Münster, Germany.
This podcast is produced for Mike and I by our friends at Busy Media of Schenectady, New York. They can be found at busymedia.co.